You must stay at home. Stay at home.
Hello, and welcome to Lockdown, hosted by Steve Bomford with Mike Davis-Marks. Our armed forces operate in challenging environments. Week by week, we'll explore what we can learn from their experiences.
Hello, Steve. I understand you've got an old friend of mine for your next podcast episode.
That's it. I'm running Mike's Friends Reunited for you. How is that? Am I doing a good job?
Moderately so. I mean, you've got a long way to go, to be honest. Anyway, it's David Noyes, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I'm slowly working my way through your friends list. He is Chief Executive of Solent NHS Trust.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends in good places. Always good to see them do well.
Indeed it is. So let's have a little listen to see what he's got to say. David, thank you very much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
That's a great pleasure. Nice to see you.
And you. So I've got a few questions for you, so let's get started. So if you could just tell me a little bit about your experience in the Royal Navy, please.
Yeah, sure. So I joined the Navy in 1985 as a young 18-year-old. I was quite heavily influenced by, my father was a fighter pilot in the Fleet Air One back in the 50s and 60s, which I think had a big influence over me, and events of the time, as the sort of early mid 80s. So the Falklands War was very fresh in everybody's mind, and I think those two things came together and made me think that looks like a really interesting and fulfilling place to be and a good career. So I went through the whole process and went down to Dartmouth as a cadet at age of 18. Spent a few months running around Dartmoor and up and down big hills and being shouted at by parade instructors and what have you, like everybody else. And became midshipman, and then out to fleet training, and then a bit of professional training before starting my career as a logistics officer, and spent the next 28 years doing a variety of different things and different challenges as service life throws at you. Clearly quite a lot of sea time, particularly in my earlier career, away at sea in mostly in Type 22 frigates, but also did an appointment in HMS Illustrious, and then a series of other appointments, either ashore in Fleet HQ or a couple of times working up in Whitehall in the Ministry of Defence. And also a really good job as logistics commander in Portsmouth Dockyard, which was great. I finished off towards the end of my time. I was lucky enough to be promoted to captain, and my penultimate job was a bit unusual. I was seconded from the Navy across to the Army, to 101 Brigade, based out of Aldershot. Spent about 18 months working with the Army as deputy commander of 101 Brigade with a REME, Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers Brigadier, was my boss, and that time with them encompassed a tour of Afghanistan during Herrick 15-16 back in 2011-2012, supporting operations out there. So quite a varied time, really. I sort of think my time was kind of bookended a bit. My first proper sea experience in '87 was during fleet training. Was in HMS Brazen, and we were out in the Persian Gulf at the sort of height of the Iran-Iraq War, which was escorting British flag tankers up through the Straits of Hormuz at action stations, across the missile fields and through the minefields and what have you, with minesweepers supporting up by Bahrain. And then sort of right at the back end of my time out in Afghanistan, but a lot of different things in between, a lot of fun and a lot of different experiences.
Crikey, and all that in 6 months? No, so how long did all that take? So you're in for a little while, weren't you?
Yeah, 20. I started with a full head of hair and my own teeth, and look at me now.
I couldn't possibly comment. So, what inspired you, given all that background, to join the NHS? Because that sounds like something very different to me.
Yeah, I mean, different, but more similarities than you might think or might imagine. I think, Steve. I had a great 28 years, really, and if I was 18, I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. But you come to a point in time with life when you make a change. And I decided back in sort of 2013 that I probably was looking to try and take on something new, a different sort of set of challenges. And I've always been attracted to a second career in the health service at some point. I suppose because I have that sort of slightly unfashionable but public service altruism coursing through me, and I like to think that what I'm doing is making a difference to people and making people's lives better. And there's actually a significant sort of crossover of skills between a lot of what military people do and certainly what I was lucky enough to do and do during my time in the service that actually are applicable within the health service. So that and the culture really of that willingness to sort of serve, if you like, but also but to put the best into it in order to make things better and drive success. A really good transferable bits of culture. And the skill sets of, I'm fortunate to find myself in a job as Chief Operating Officer where I, run large teams of guys across the whole of Hampshire. Our footprint is predominantly across the south belt of Hampshire in the two big cities, Southampton, Portsmouth. Increasingly delivering services on the Isle of Wight, but we do have some significant services across the entirety of Hampshire, and a regional lead for a veterans mental health service, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure. But driving big teams of people, helping set objectives and generating operational success, managing budgets, managing people, managing targets to hit and what have you is all stuff which I was familiar with from my time in the service, really.
I think it's quite interesting or quite striking, isn't it? How many people who have been in the armed forces who go on to work and support and serve again, if you like, serve communities again, or work in the voluntary sector or the charitable sector. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, the chief executive of Solent, Sue Harriman, is an ex Naval nurse. We've got a good smattering of veterans across our organisation. But I agree. I think you see a lot of ex-service people going into this sort of areas that you describe. Absolutely.
Interesting. So we were talking before we started this call. You asked me about a meeting that I'd been to for the first time, and just talking about the NHS more broadly. And one of the things I said was that even though I've kind of dealt with the NHS all my life, I've not been in the service and had that kind of support that you get looking after your health when you're in the military. That navigating and sort of understanding what the NHS does can sometimes be very, very complicated. And that kind of leads me to my next question. What does Solent NHS Trust actually do?
Yeah, sure. So we are a trust which delivers community services and mental health services across that patch which I described. But we as part of that, we deliver some quite specialist services, under that umbrella. But predominantly we are an organisation which delivers health outcomes in the community setting, which is a little bit jargonistic, isn't it? But so we run teams of community nurses and community therapists, people that will come and visit people in their own homes or in their care homes, or wherever they are living, and deliver health care that, at or close to people's homes. So therapeutic interventions or medical interventions, or nursing, whether it's helping people who have dexterity problems with insulin injections, or helping people on, sadly, obviously a reality with end of life, with administration of pain relief, through to wound care, help people with ulcerating wounds and what have you, as well as helping people with a rehabilitation journey, work that we do often in very close partnership, almost always very close partnership with our colleagues in the councils in both the big cities, helping people with physiotherapy, getting the mobility back after an injury or a surgical operation. We have occupational therapists that help people to adapt to their new circumstances that they find themselves in, speech and language therapists, and people who help people get back on their feet. We also deliver a whole range of interventions and assistance for children and families. So particularly children's medical intervention. So we have children's community nurses that do similar work in the community with children. Some very complicated interventions that we can do in people's homes. For example, certain types of chemotherapy for children who might sadly have cancer. But we also have child interventions in the mental health sphere. So children and young adults, children and adolescent mental health services we deliver, and children's therapies, children's physiotherapy and speech and language therapy as well across the piece. We do specialist physiotherapy work. We do podiatry work in both cities and across the belt of South Hampshire. Sexual health services across the whole of Hampshire. Specialist dental, which is a service for people who have difficulty or are unable to access normal high street dentistry. So commonly people with learning disabilities or severe phobia or mental health issues, people with dementia. We can do that either in clinic or in a domestic visiting service. And in the city of Portsmouth, we deliver mental health services, so specialist acute mental health services for adults and older people. So it's a big range of service offer across the piece, really.
I think you're doing well to remember all that, let alone deliver it all.
I've probably missed a few, Steve, to be honest. It's.
So that must be quite a big organisation and must come with its own challenges, many challenges, I would have thought. But obviously we're here to talk about the military side of things and veterans. And I would like to talk a bit about Operation Courage, which has been a new banner organisation, if I got that right, in terms of Johnny Mercer making that announcement from the Office of Veterans Affairs. And more specifically, what's going on in the Portsmouth area and the surrounding area of Portsmouth in relation to veterans' mental health? What are you doing in that space?
Yeah, thanks. So we've got, we approach our work with veterans and the veterans community really in three different sort of buckets, if you like. Not a very elegant way of describing it, is it? But in three spheres. We as a trust, within our own trust, do our best to help people who are in transition from the service, leaving already working with the trust. We have a veterans network and a series of events to keep the sort of veteran flame alive. Talk to veterans, coach people on their journey. Look for opportunities for us, because it's a good place for veterans to be, and so we have a series of trust-wide interventions for our own veteran community, if you like. And then we are very, very proud to be heavily involved with a whole host of partner organisations in the Portsmouth arena, as alluded to, and we're growing that alliance across the entirety of Hampshire, Isle of Wight, but it started definitely in Portsmouth with a thing called the Portsmouth Military Mental Health Alliance, and that's a sort of umbrella organisation where we try and succeed in bringing all sorts of different people who have a stake in and an interest in veterans affairs, particularly obviously veterans mental health, bring them together into a common forum that's about sharing experience, sharing expertise, sharing a bit of knowledge, and helping to try and pull together in the Portsmouth space, in particular, obviously a heavily military area of Navy and indeed Army, together to try and make service delivery a little bit more coherent, a little bit easier to access, and find out a little bit more about each other, so that we can help each other to make the service delivery a lot better. And we've got, as a trust, as an organisation, we've got some arrangements with big stakeholders like the Royal Navy, Royal Marines Charity, and we deliver some interventions for them and indeed for Navy Command in terms of helping people, both veterans and serving, with issues like addiction, gambling, and alcohol addiction, and the like. But the Military Mental Health Alliance itself is all to do with trying to be a little bit more coherent in the space. It's quite for very good reasons and for all very well-intentioned reasons. I think the space for veterans, particularly if they're starting to suffer with mental health issues or starting to tip into crisis, can be quite a complex area because there's lots of different organisations which, for really good reasons, have evolved and developed on their own and do different niche areas of service intervention, but that can inadvertently make the pathways to where people getting the right help that they need, a little bit complicated. So the Alliance is a way of seeking to, share that experience across the provision side of life, so that we can try and make it better for people. And we're doing some work, to collaborate across that piece in terms of trying to, coming up with common approaches for things like the Recovery College, and working with our partners across the piece for rapid intervention for people, and a sort of escalating scale if people need. The ideal is to try and get to people as quickly as possible if they're starting to suffer, and help them to rationalise and help them to work through their issues at the lowest possible level, prevent them tipping into crisis, and work also obviously with their families, partners, children, and what have you. So it's a real joy to be part of that, and that sort of leads on to the third area, which is this thing badged now nationally as Op Courage. Which is the Veterans Mental Health High Intensity Service, where we deliver the service ourselves for Hampshire, Isle of Wight, but we're lucky enough to be the lead for the whole South East region. So we work with our partners from East and West Sussex, Kent, Berkshire, Oxfordshire, and the like, and Surrey, with a model of service delivery which sits beneath the traditional, more high intensity veterans mental health provision from the NHS, your TILS and CTS type services, but it's called the high intensity service, and it's a thing that we deliver closely in partnership with two organisations, Walking the Wounded and All Call Signs, who are both voluntary sector. Walking the Wounded, a charity; All Call Signs, a voluntary sector organisation. We're very much crewed by, manned by, and delivered by veterans, and that the service model for that is a team of our own clinical guys, clinical psychologists, particularly it's a psychological based intervention, but working with All Call Signs and Walking the Wounded, who provide a great deal of peer support. From their guys, peer support and sort of social care type support, and the strength of it is that those voluntary sector workers, the All Call Signs and Walking the Wounded guys, are veterans, so they do have lived experience, and therefore we find the real success of the model is that veterans find it a lot easier on the whole to open up and talk to and relate to people who have the shared experience, the lived experience. They've taken a walk in the same boots, and so that we are finding it that actually it is an incredibly effective way of helping people to really understand, and then we can help them. Either deal with them within the service ourselves, or we can help via things like the mental health alliances, which we're trying to now replicate across that entire southeast region, as you'd imagine, to signpost to the right service to help people get the help that they need, which includes, occasionally referral to our own clinical psychological teams, and if necessary, if people require it, then escalation up to the traditional TILS and CTS. So it's proving to be a real joy to be part of. We're managing to help since the official launch. We launched in Hampshire before Christmas, but the national launch for the thing was, as you say, a few weeks back with Johnny Mercer launching Op Courage, and we're finding that as the message grows, we're getting quite a lot of referrals in, which is great because we're able to reach out and help a lot of people.
Wow, there's a lot going on. That sounds really positive. So in terms of referrals, is this to access any of these services, have you got to be referred by a GP? I'm just thinking about, for our listeners' point of view, you might be in need or thinking about getting some support. How do they go about that? What's the process?
Well, the way that is a way to get into the service, but actually, we've got to link up with 111. The 111 provision. So if people can call 111, identify themselves as a veteran, identify what their issue is, and they'll get referred into the service that way. That's in place in Hampshire, Isle of Wight, And we're hoping that will be picked up across our regional model. And there's potential for that eventually to become a national thing. But at the moment in Hampshire, Isle of Wight, so 111 is the best referral point into that.
So basically, anybody that's feeling, a bit out of sorts, that's the option, is to call 111.
Yeah, or you can go via your own primary care, of course, or indeed if anybody who's in touch with any of those organisations as part of the Military Mental Health Alliance, which could be, VOS, the Veterans Outreach Service in Portsmouth, or Walking the Wounded, or Callside, any of those guys who are Ripple Pond, the Hive, all of those people who are involved, they all know how to refer. So Solent Mind, the Solent Recovery College, all of those people have the ability to refer in. So we've got quite a wide net cast out there.
Sounds good. A lot of those organisations you've just mentioned would normally be operating face to face, wouldn't they? I know all call signs have a unit down on Albert Road. VOS obviously is a monthly drop in, and we can't do that at the moment, pretty much, although things are hopefully relaxing over the coming months. Have you seen any challenges or changes? How about accessing services digitally, or has there been a sort of change in need because of the last 12 months? Has that had an impact upon people?
I think it's definitely. I mean, obviously, the whole this last 12 months has been an extraordinary challenge for the entire country, hasn't it? But we've managed to find new and innovative ways of reaching people, digitally primarily, of course, which is often I say often, not always, but often a very good way of maintaining service and maintaining contact. I think it has limitations naturally, and I think some people are naturally a bit more reluctant to use it. And we have, this is a wider issue that we rest with in healthcare, not just in the sort of veterans mental health space, but this issue of digital poverty. It would be a mistake, I think, to go full square into a 100% digital remote consultation type solution, because not everybody has either the means to have a smartphone or a laptop or a tablet or what have you, or necessarily the technical skills in truth to do it. So it's so I think these some of the digital solutions we've been playing with, and we've rolled out some really successful things in the past year, which we'll keep. But I don't think it's the answer to everything. I think you always have to have a provision that accepts and accommodates the fact that that's not an answer that everybody will find that useful. And fundamentally, the delivery of certainly physical healthcare requires caring nursing staff, therapy staff, medical staff to lay hands on people, and there's no getting away from that. You can do an awful lot remotely, you can do an awful lot using Zoom or Teams and what have you. But I think my own personal view is that the delivery of healthcare is fundamentally a human-to-human contact sort of business. So that will never change.
Do you think there'll be a hybrid model going forward?
Yeah, I do. I think there's, as I say, there's a lot of learning, from the COVID crisis, and I think in some ways, none of us would have voted for this, would be, because it's been awful and people have lost their lives. But it has helped to accelerate some of these solutions and some of these innovations, which are good. But I think we have to keep testing ourselves, keep challenging ourselves about excuse me, that accessibility. It's a real big issue for us anywhere in healthcare about the accessibility of our services, and make sure that we are fully available and reach into every part of our society. And sometimes that isn't as our ability to reach in isn't quite as good as it should be. So I think it is an area that will be a hybrid into the future, but not in every regard. So I think you'll see a mixed economy moving forward. No doubt, some improvement. But as I say, I think we need to be ambitious and innovative, but careful that we don't leave people behind. Yeah. Because probably the people that we would leave behind, if we did, would be those more hard to reach. It's a bit of a overused term, but the areas of privation that we really want to reach into are likely the areas where people do struggle to access tech. So we have to be cautious about that.
I must admit, we've been very, because as we talked about before this interview, this chat, the company makers, we just had to port everything online because obviously face-to-face was impossible. And we've been genuinely surprised about those that have really enjoyed the online experience, who, on paper you might have thought, I'm not sure they would like that. And yet others just haven't taken to it at all and sort of done one session and thought, no, I'd rather come down and do something at the fort or whatever it may be. It's not, you can't easily judge a person's reaction to it. That's what I find quite interesting about digital and face-to-face.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we've seen the same. It can, as I said, it can be a really effective tool, but I don't think it's it's not the answer to a maiden's prayer. It doesn't hit everybody. It doesn't get everywhere.
No. So sorry, I asked a terrible multiple question before we did this. The other part I wanted to ask to come back to was, how do you think COVID has affected all of people's mental health and well-being generally, and specifically within the veteran space, or has it not made any difference? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is a cause of concern for us moving forward. I think the impact of the implications and the impact of extended periods in lockdown and the restrictions on social contact at the end of the day to avoid spreading the virus have had and will have far-reaching implications for mental health across the community. Actually, veterans, no exception to that. And I think we're already starting to see some evidence of that with growth of referrals. I think it's too early to say. I think there's it's the Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns out there, but I think there's a real potential for long-term and far-reaching implications of that in the mental health space, and it'll take some time to work all that through. I think from my own as our own trust, our own provision, like so we're elsewhere across the entire health service, and you've seen this all over the media a lot over the last 12 months with people working incredibly hard, and whether it's in intensive care units or what have you. We have within Solent, our staff have been absolutely fantastic. But we've asked them to do some extraordinary things, and we've changed what they do, redeployed them, to use a military term, taken them off of what their original purpose was, asked them to do COVID-facing tasks. We generated significant numbers of additional community ward bed space. So one of the areas of service, as I said, in district nursing and community nursing, is people who come to their own homes, but we also have wards of beds for people on a rehabilitation journey. We generated significant numbers of additional beds and asked people who would often be doing other work, particularly in physiotherapy and what have you, to redeploy and staff those beds up. People out of sexual health and what have you, core trained nurses, but we did a whole retraining package. But yeah, that sort of bending out of shape in service provision naturally has an impact. So, like everywhere else in the health service, a lot of my guys are very, very weary. They've been working long and hard, extended hours, often in unfamiliar environments, for quite an extended period now. We're leading the Hampshire Isle of Wight mass vaccination centres as well, as it happens. So we're a big player alongside colleagues from primary care and community pharmacies, delivering the vaccination programme. So we've got people, again, redeployed out, working in vaccination centres, doing long shifts, 7 days a week, trying to get the protection into people, which is brilliant work, and they're doing a fantastic job of it and thriving in it. But at the end of all this, it's like a 12 months and counting long op tour, to use the military vernacular. So people are getting pretty weary. So there's going to be we need to think of a way to plan our way through that, because once this is all over, of course, people want to get back to, the public will naturally want to, get themselves sorted out with their healthcare needs. So, it's not like we can stop and take a couple of weeks leave. We've got to carry on delivering, doing what we're doing. So that will take some nuanced planning, and there'll be like elsewhere across health, doubtless in some of our sort of elective services, waiting lists have been growing because, while COVID has pretty dominated the agenda for the last 12 months or so, people have still got the same afflictions the same things that need an intervention. So at the moment, like everywhere else across the country, our waiting lists are growing, and that's going to take some time to clear to pre-COVID levels.
Do you think there's, you've used a few sort of military phrases in terms of deployment. Do you think there's learning for the NHS from the military world here in terms of the well-being and dealing with some of the challenges that this extended deployment, as you put it, has caused for staff? I'm talking about particularly.
Yeah, I think there is some, and I think there were some sort of similarities. And I think within health, the blue light services, the ambulance services are quite accustomed to working at high intensity in a high trauma sort of environment. But I think there are lessons in terms of helping people sort of reset, reflect on their experiences. And so we've designed within the trust quite a comprehensive staff wellbeing offer to try and help people reconcile to what their experience have been. But we're obviously thankfully at the moment on the sort of downward slope of the second wave pretty much, and things are starting to ease up. But activity is still quite high, and where we sit in the health service on that rehabilitation element, with people, particularly the long COVID is becoming an increasingly well recognised condition. Our guys are still busy, so it's going to be with us for a while. But yeah, all of those sort of interventions, I think there is some learning, and we've been lucky enough to be able to lean into that and design some of our staff wellbeing and reflective practice to reflect that in our own wellbeing offer.
I think it's interesting when you sort of, obviously in the news, we see lots of numbers and statistics about COVID, and it's sometimes I don't always appreciate all the people behind all of that, because you don't get to see it. Obviously, I don't get to see it on a day-to-day basis, and I think the NHS deserves all the plaudits it's been getting, as far as I'm concerned. And to you and your team, thank you.
Well, it's very kind of you to say that. I think the whole NHS has really stood up and been there when the country needed it at most. So yeah, we're incredibly proud of what our teams have achieved, and been incredibly responsive, dynamic and flexible in changing really rapidly, implementing some of that new remote consultation type tech that we were talking about earlier on, but changing entire roles, doing incredible hours, because our people are fantastically committed to delivering the best possible care for the population. And they've been absolutely fantastic in that.
I couldn't agree more. So one final question. What can we do to encourage those in need to come forward? I'm particularly talking about the military side of your work here. What do we need to do differently or more of? What do you think would make a difference? Is there anything we can do?
I think it's a constant. It's a bit like painting the Forth Road Bridge. It's you've got to keep at it. Keep going, but communicating all the time, and to encourage people to come forward and use the services. And in the mental health sphere, it's becoming quite a well-known saying, and it's okay not to be okay, and everybody gets that and understands that. I think there's some incredible examples of people now going very publicly and talking about some of their mental health struggles that they've had. Very prominent people in public life are talking very openly about that, and I think that's all. It's all good, because it's something which can and does affect people from all walks of life, no matter what, at all levels. It does no respect of background or gender or race or level or rank or any of those sort of things. It's it's a phenomenally human condition. So I think it's okay to not be okay, and the help is there, and there are across areas like the Portsmouth Mental Health Alliance, certainly here within Solent, there are professional people that are dedicated to helping people through, and so that's a good thing, and they're there to help.
Yeah, I quite agree. I think you've mentioned a lot of support organisations, certainly locally, some of which I'm aware of, some I'm not. If you could send us through all that information, we can include that in the description of the podcast. So if any of our listeners want to find out a bit more about those organisations and services, If that could be included, we can do that after we've recorded, obviously, but just please do send it through, David. That would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, it'd be our pleasure.
And finally, I would just like to thank you for coming on the podcast. You've enlightened me into my initial question. What does Solent NHS Trust do? I now know more than I did. So thank you very much for that. And I hope our listeners will benefit from that insight as well.
Great pleasure. No, thanks very much, Steve.
Wow, there was a lot in there, Mike. He does have an awful lot of responsibility, doesn't he? So what did you make of it?
Well, it seems like he's almost had two separate careers, each of great significance, joined at the hip by the public service link between the two of them, but in other respects, completely different. Yeah, I thought it was fantastic.
He certainly likes a challenge, doesn't he?
So for the benefit of your listeners, he said he was 28 years in the Royal Navy as a logistics officer, which is known colloquially as a pusser. But actually, it does so much more than that, because he's responsible not just for counting peas and blankets, but running a whole range of support operations without which the Navy and the Marines wouldn't function. So when we worked together, he was the executive assistant, effectively the secretary of one of the admirals that worked in the Ministry of Defence, a very influential and powerful position. So he's done a lot in his time, including wearing what one of your previous interviewers, Bill Oliphant, describes as army pajamas when he was deputy commander of 101 Brigade in Afghanistan. And now there's some diversity for you.
There is. I'm still sort of struggling with the idea of him counting peas.
Yeah, that's what we call the logistics branch, pea counters or blanket counters. Anyway, actually, really interesting how his career, when he left the Navy, took a new turn in joining this NHS Trust, the Solent NHS Trust. And I think I heard you say that you were enlightened by his talk. Is that correct?
That's a good word, isn't it? Enlightened. Yes, I was, because even though we spend a lot of time helping and supporting people, and of course you have your own personal healthcare to look after, I do find the NHS to be an incredibly complicated world, incredibly complicated.
Yeah, very. I mean, he described, some of the responsibilities of the Solent NHS Trust, and it wasn't just about delivering healthcare in the community. He talked about physio and meds and therapy and palliative care and chemo to children and mental health and spelling and speech and language and specialist dental, just amongst a few. I mean, it's a huge range of activities that he's he and his team are in charge of, and they cover quite a large area, the whole of southern Hampshire, including the two municipalities of Southampton and Portsmouth. That is, as you said at the start, a lot of responsibility.
It's a heck of a lot of responsibility, but we do need these services, don't we?
We absolutely do. And he was good to link, his 28 years in the Navy to what he's now doing as chief exec of this trust, through what he called public service, and he called it rather unfashionable to, be in public service. And I don't think I agree with that. I actually think public service is something that we should be proud of. And, the fact that you join, an organisation like the NHS or the Armed Forces or the police and all the blue light services, not because you want to make money, but because you want to make a difference. And I think, I like the way he linked the two through that. Altruism is what he used, the word.
Which is also a very good word. Yes, I quite agree. And I think particularly in, given the last year we've had in public service, well, I think a lot of us wouldn't be here without some rather excellent public service.
Yeah, I think right at the end, he said, I think it was a lovely statement. He said the NHS stood up and were there for the country when it needed it most. And I think, I think we all would agree with that. He then, I liked the way that he then started talking about, you asked him the question, mental health services, and particularly what he's doing in the Portsmouth region as part of a bigger jigsaw, which is called Op Courage. And I've heard the term before, but I hadn't really sort of investigated it fully until that interview. So really interesting to know what's going on. I know it's been only launched very recently, but really, really good that the MOD and the services are getting to grips with this. And I think, you and Company of Makers have been part of this for many years now. And suddenly now, it's starting to become, much more mainstream. The phrase he used was, it's okay not to be okay. And I thought that was another good statement.
Yeah, I agree. And there's lots of organisations that are lots of local organisations that are contributing. As he mentioned there, All Call Signs, Veterans Outreach Support, Shore Leave Hasler over in Gosport. So it's that kind of collaboration between statutory, charity, that's I think is making a difference, particularly in Portsmouth. I think it's changed beyond recognition in the last few years in Portsmouth.
Yeah, he talks about the Portsmouth Military Mental Health Alliance, which he's part of, and he describes it as a forum for stakeholders that they can provide some coherence and joined up thinking in the space. And I think, that's clearly, this has always been one of the issues, with things like healthcare, is there are lots of good people doing lots of good things, but not necessarily in a joined up way. And when you have these initiatives which start to bring people together so they can collaborate, the sum of the parts is greater than the sum of the whole, because actually getting people working together, sharing best practice, not duplicating effort, is got to be the right way ahead. So I think I really admire what he's doing. And I suspect what he's doing here in Portsmouth is actually pioneering for the whole Op Courage project.
I'm sure it is. And as one of those really small organisations, it's just good to hear what other people are doing, because you wouldn't ordinarily bump into an organisation that's delivering, certainly outside of the Portsmouth area. And I think that's really important to know what other services, who's involved, and how you can collaborate, what the opportunities are.
Yeah, exactly that. He used a couple of acronyms which I didn't understand, so I immediately Googled them. And he used the word TIL and CTS, and I'm guessing everybody else knows what they are apart from me. But just in case one person doesn't, TIL stands for Transition, Intervention and Liaison. And it's a service that's provided as part of CTS, which stands for Complex Treatment Service. So you don't know what you don't know. There's a couple of things that I've been enlightened on since that.
But that's important, isn't it? Because you hear all this jargon, people may not know what it means, and it's important that we explain it so that people who may be in need can access those services because they actually know what's available.
I mean, all organisations are guilty of jargon, and the armed forces no exception here. We're always going on about TLAs, which stands for three-letter acronyms, by the way. I think the problem with jargon is that if you're in the inner circle, you understand it, and if you're anywhere out of that, you probably don't. And good communication is trying to keep it jargon-free so that everybody understands and everybody can contribute. So, yes, you're absolutely right.
It's very off-putting as well, isn't it? Very, especially for people that are not, as you say, in that circle.
Yeah, it can be very OTT.
Oh, very good.
No, I don't think so. You asked him about how it will, was going through COVID and remote versus face-to-face and things like that. And I thought it was quite instructive that he thought that, working remotely brought its own challenges, obviously, and there are some things you can't do as well as you could do. But he also said that actually that means people had to innovate. And you and I have seen a lot of that through some of the people that you've interviewed for these series, in that actually you just have to adapt to the circumstances, and those that do will generally succeed. It's just another challenge. I think Pete Reed in his podcast talked about it. You can't control what's happened, but you can control what you do about it. And I think that's a fantastic attitude.
Yeah, control the controllables, I think it is. I don't know if there's an acronym for that, though.
I'll think of one.
Okay, I look forward to it. By the end of the episode, please.
CTC. Staff, he talked about the weariness of the staff, and I don't think he was just referring to his staff now. I think his staff were a microcosm of, the key workers that have been working non-stop since, March last year when the pandemic was declared and lockdown started for the first time. And, here we are sort of 12 months plus later, and we're still, albeit that, the curves are going in the right direction for the moment. A lot of people have had have been non-stop in that period. And they can't simply stop when it is over, because there's a whole raft of stuff to catch up on that is now on a big waiting list. So you've got to feel for these people that have been just going at it for the last 12 months without a break.
Yeah, obviously we dealt with the immediate problem. I guess we have a vaccine program rolling out, which is all great news. But as you say, this is going to create some big waiting lists. We've got the challenges of long COVID. I was reading some fairly frightening numbers that people might be affected by that. So this is, if it all ended today, the legacy is going to be dealt with over several years, I think.
Yeah. I didn't know this, but he said that he and his team were responsible for running the vaccination program in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, which is really, I didn't know that. And they're doing, of course, an extraordinarily good job. And I received my jab about 8 weeks ago now, and it was a pretty fantastic, slick event for me, and I think for everybody else that I've spoken to as well. So they are doing a magnificent job, and I think they're slightly ahead of the national trend in terms of which age group they're going through. So doing a really fantastic job. So I didn't know that. That's brilliant.
The advantages of a national health service, it would seem.
Yeah, we've spoken about the NHS a lot of times over this, and and at the moment, they're doing us proud. But we need to worry, of course, about what happens next. So, when we're through this pandemic and we've got a big backlog of stuff to do. Do you remember an interview we did 3 or 4 years ago on HMS Warrior when we talked about too much money spent on curative care and not on preventative care? And I still believe that we need to put more money into preventing disease and illness than we do at the moment, and then we can spend less on actually mending it or repairing it when people get broken.
Yes, I think we'd all agree. It's just a case of having the vision to do that. I think we even touched on that idea in one of Adrian's interviews about how do we plan further than just the election cycle. But obviously, we wouldn't have a national health service if we weren't planning beyond an election cycle. So I think the organisations there, it always comes down to money and where you choose to spend it, doesn't it?
Yeah, indeed. One last thing, Steve. I think David, who's top bloke, is a really good example of the sort of transferable skills that military people have of all shapes and sizes, ranks and rates, when they transfer to Civvy Street, and he's stepped into that role, and he's not been trained to run an NHS trust before, but he's been trained in a number of other things, including people management and leadership and things like that, and he's clearly doing a really good job. So, and I think there's example again of the transfer of skills the military have, and actually, if you are military and listening to this and worrying about where you're going to go in Civvy Street, please don't underestimate the transferable skills you've got. You may think you have nothing to offer, and I can promise you that is not true. You have a huge amount to offer. Your attitude and can-do attitude and the way in which you approach life is one thing that will sorely need it and will stand you by when you apply it in another job in a civilian piece of clothing. So transferable skills, you've got them in checkloads.
I would agree. I think the only challenge is sometimes translating. We're talking back to acronyms again. What does all that mean in the military jargon, and what does that look like in the civilian context? I think that can be a challenge, but I think in terms of skills and attitude, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So have faith in yourself, people. Have faith.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks for listening. The Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity exists to support sailors, Marines and their families for life. If you or someone you know could do with some support, give them a call on 023 93 87 1568 or drop them an email on support@rnrmc.org.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more, please subscribe.